The wind rolled low through the plains that evening, dragging with it the scent of cold dust and far-off wood smoke. Jonas Talbot stood beside a crooked fence post, squinting westward where the sun bled out over the hills. His shirt clung to his back from the day's labor, the kind that left a man sore in places he didn't know had muscles. His hands were blistered, and the heel of his boot had come loose again. He hadn't eaten since dawn, and he was thinking more about that than anything else until he heard the whisper. It wasn't words, not at first. Just a sound like dried leaves shifting in a breathless hush. But then it came clearer, soft and impossibly small. "Mister, may we have shelter?" Jonas turned toward the barn, half expecting the wind to have played him for a fool. But there they stood. 4 of them. No taller than the fence rail. 3 boys and a girl, all about the same size, their arms looped together in silent symmetry. Barefoot, their feet cracked and red from gravel and wind. Their clothes were thin, more rag than stitch, and one of the boys had no sleeves at all. The girl stood in the center, chin lifted as if protecting the others by will alone. They didn't cry. They didn't beg. Just stood there like ghosts too stubborn to pass on. Jonas didn't speak right away. He took one step closer and watched as none of them flinched. Their eyes were hollow with waiting for a door to open or slam shut. Waiting for the world to do what it always did. The silence stretched. Then Jonas took off his gloves and said, "Come in out of the wind." He led them toward the cabin slowly, letting them follow on their own time. One of the boys limped, and the smallest one clung to the hem of the girl's dress like a shadow trying not to be noticed. The girl walked with her shoulders squared like she'd already decided she'd fight anyone who tried to stop her. Agatha was inside, shelling peas into a tin basin. When Jonas opened the door, she looked up and froze. Her eyes went first to his face, then to the line of children behind him. She dropped a pea into the basin and it echoed like thunder. No words passed between them. Agatha moved aside, clearing space near the hearth. She fetched a wool blanket from the cedar chest without needing to be told. The children didn't speak, not even when she brought them bread and water. They took it with quiet hands, eating like they didn't trust it to stay. Jonas leaned against the wall, watching. He remembered the way Agatha used to hold her belly at night and hum lullabies to someone who never came. He remembered the tiny shoes she'd knitted in winter and later thrown into the fire. The room hadn't heard children's voices in 5 years. Now it held 4, though none of them made a sound. After supper, the smallest boy fell asleep sitting up, his head nodding forward like a sunflower bowing to dusk. Agatha caught him gently and laid him down. The others followed suit, too tired or too young to question comfort. When the last one closed their eyes, Jonas stepped out onto the porch. The stars were beginning to gather, cautious and few. He lit his pipe, though he didn't smoke it. Just let it burn like a companion. The silence around him wasn't peaceful, it was the kind that held its breath, waiting to see what would happen come morning. Agatha joined him after a while, her shawl pulled tight. She didn't speak right away, and neither did he. They'd grown used to that kind of quiet over the years, comfortable, familiar. "How long you think they been walking?" she asked finally. Jonas shook his head. "Long enough to not ask for more than shelter." Agatha looked out into the dark. "They yours?" she asked. It wasn't a question of law. It was one of spirit. Jonas's jaw worked for a moment. "They are now." Agatha nodded once, then turned and went back inside. When he followed, he found her kneeling beside the girl, tucking the blanket up to her chin like she had with no one since that lost winter. Her hands lingered longer than needed. That night, Jonas lay awake staring at the ceiling. Rain tapped gently against the roof. Every creak of the wood sounded like a whisper from a world changed without warning. He tried to think of where they'd come from. Who they belonged to. What they'd seen. But mostly, he just thought of the look in the girl's eyes when she asked for shelter. There was something in it that went deeper than fear. Unknowing. When he finally drifted off, it was to the sound of small breathing, uneven and warm, coming from the quilted nest beside the hearth. By morning, the children were still there, still silent, still close to one another like petals clinging to the same stem. Agatha had already started breakfast, the smell of corn cakes and lard drifting through the air like a promise. The girl stood by the window, watching the light. Her hands rested on the sill, small and cracked, but steady. "Got names?" Jonas asked softly. She didn't turn. Just said, "We did." Agatha's breath hitched from across the room. She turned away, her hand clenching the wooden spoon so tightly it nearly splintered. Jonas crouched near the girl and nodded. "Well, you got time to find new ones, if you want 'em." That was when one of the boys reached for his hand. Not to speak. Just to hold. Jonas let him. Outside, the wind had died down, and the trees were still. The world had shifted. He could feel it, not in some grand, thunderous way, but in the quiet beat of something finding its place. Something lost, warming its bones by the fire. He didn't know what would come tomorrow. Whether someone would arrive with claims and papers. Whether the town would whisper. Whether the girl by the window would ever trust the world enough to smile. But he knew this. They had come barefoot. And he had answered. And sometimes, that was the beginning of everything. The next morning, Jonas saddled the mule cart while dew still clung to the weeds, silvering the prairie grass and hush. The sky was soft with early light, that pearled color before full sun, and the dirt road still wore last night's chill. The children sat inside the wagon without speaking, bundled in old blankets Agatha had sewn from scraps. Their eyes scanned the land like animals unsure if the field held safety or ambush. The girl, older only by minutes maybe, kept her arms around the smallest boy, who hadn't said a single word since stepping onto their land. Jonas didn't ask questions. Not because he didn't want answers, but because silence sometimes said more. He'd known men who talked to hide things and children who'd learned not to speak because truth cost too much. They reached town before the bells rang. Dusty buildings lined the single road like half-finished thoughts. The livery was yawning awake, and someone was sweeping the porch of the dry goods store with more noise than purpose. Jonas pulled up in front of the chapel and helped the children down one by one. His hands lingered on each of them longer than needed. Pastor Whitfield opened the door with a mix of warmth and weariness, wiping biscuit crumbs from his beard. He blinked at the group and stepped aside without asking why they'd come. Inside the chapel, Jonas stood with his hat in his hands, dust falling in lazy shafts through the stained glass. He explained what little he knew, how they'd come barefoot, no names, no family in sight. How they hadn't said much but looked too tired for lying. He hoped the pastor might know of a nearby farm missing children, or someone downriver searching. Whitfield leaned back, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes narrowed. "No missing posters. No writers asking," he murmured. "No one sent word. But children like this, someone will. Eventually." Jonas stiffened. "They're not livestock waiting for someone to post-claim." "No," Whitfield agreed quietly. "But the world don't always see the difference." They left the chapel to find the first whispers already curling through town like smoke. Eunice Rayburn stood outside the post office, arms folded across her bodice like a badge of suspicion. She leaned toward Mrs. Hadley, lowering her voice just enough to be heard. "4 of 'em. Just appeared, they say. Same age, too. That don't smell right." Jonas walked past without pausing, but the children heard. One of the boys tugged at his blanket, face drawn tight. At the general store, the girl tried to pick up a tin of buttons while Jonas paid for sugar and flour. Eunice saw it and clicked her tongue. "Watch her hands, Talbot. Street kids don't always know what's theirs and what ain't." Jonas looked Eunice square in the eye. "She knows better than most what people take from you when you're small." That shut her up for a moment, but it only paused the fire, it didn't put it out. When they got home, Agatha had hung fresh linens near the stove and placed wooden bowls on the table. She'd boiled bone broth, the kind she only made when there wasn't enough meat but too much love not to try. She didn't ask about town, but Jonas saw it in her face, she already knew. Later that day, she brought out old children's clothes she hadn't thrown out after all. A faded bonnet. A pair of overalls too short for any future that once was. The children accepted them wordlessly, changing in corners of the cabin with their backs turned. Even the youngest boy looked ashamed of being seen. Agatha sat on the porch that evening, darning a sock, her hands working fast though her face was far away. They heard what was said, didn't they? Jonas didn't answer. He didn't have to. That night, he took out the small wood-carving knife he'd used once to shape a cradle that never got used. He sanded 4 tiny horses out of pine, rough but steady. He left them near the children's bedding, not saying a word. In the morning, they were gone, but he found them tucked into the children's shirt pockets and one hidden under the girl's pillow like a secret kept close. On the 3rd day, Agatha took the children to Lottie Gray's home, an old widow who was mostly blind but known for knitting warmth into everything she touched. Agatha said it would give her something to do, and maybe let the children feel seen without being watched. Lottie didn't flinch when they entered, didn't squint or lean in. She just smiled and said, "I can tell you brought good hearts with dirty shoes." The children relaxed. The mute boy crawled into her lap like he'd been waiting for permission his whole life. But word spread faster than welcome. The children became a curiosity, a question mark that people filled with their own fears. No one offered bread. No one sent toys or books. But plenty offered warnings. What'll happen if someone shows up with a badge, or ain't you worried they're cursed, all being the same age? At church the next week, pews shifted as the Talbots walked in with the children between them. Agatha held the girl's hand, her chin high even as the whispers rose around her. Jonas sat straight, one hand resting near the boys' shoulders, ready if anyone thought to get near them. Pastor Whitfield's sermon was on found things, lost sheep, forgotten coins, prodigal sons. But no one missed the weight in his voice when he said, "Not everything lost is meant to be returned. Sometimes what's found was always yours, you just hadn't known it yet." On the walk home, Agatha whispered, "They don't see them as children. They see them as scandal." Jonas replied, "Then they've forgotten what it means to be human." That night, when the children were asleep, the girl awoke suddenly and crept toward the window. Agatha was already there, sitting in the dark with a shawl wrapped tight. She reached out and lifted the girl into her lap without a word. The girl leaned against her shoulder and whispered the first full sentence Agatha had heard. "Do we belong now?" Agatha's breath caught. Her arms tightened around her. "You did the moment you knocked." The fire had gone low, but the room held its warmth. Jonas, pretending to sleep, blinked into the shadows. Outside, the wind scraped against the windows but never made it in. The cabin stood, worn and quiet, sheltering 6 souls in a world that had claimed none of them but watched them all the same. The first frost came early that year, creeping over the porch rail and feathering the windows with lace like ice. Jonas woke before the roosters crowed to split kindling and light the stove before the children stirred. The mornings were colder now, and even their small bodies huddled under quilts couldn't keep the cold from their bones. He worked quietly, but not without noticing the muffled giggles as the children watched him through the crack in their makeshift curtain. 4 faces, wide-eyed and still unsure if this life would last. By now, they had names. Not the ones they were born with, those had vanished into whatever story brought them here, but ones chosen beside the fire one quiet night. Agatha had held her Bible on her lap, fingers running over the gilded edges, and asked each child gently what name felt like home. The girl chose Rose, after the bush outside the cabin that still bloomed once a year despite the dry soil. The boys picked names that sounded strong: Eli, Sam, and Clay. The youngest, still mute, touched the carved horse Jonas had given him and nodded when Jonas whispered, "Clay, then?" Names gave them shape. Roots. Jonas carved their names into the bunk above their beds, careful not to press too deep, part of him still afraid the world might take them away. Their laughter grew fuller in the weeks that followed, cautious but real. Rose helped Agatha with the laundry and started humming again, broken melodies with no lyrics. Sam followed Jonas around the barn, repeating his words in a whisper, trying to make his voice sound as deep. Eli helped chop kindling, too small to split logs but eager to carry the pieces like a duty only he could perform. Clay, silent still, clung to Rose's skirts and sometimes to Agatha's apron, especially when the wind picked up or thunder rolled. But the peace couldn't keep the world out for long. A letter came, delivered by a stranger on horseback. The envelope was smudged and damp, bearing no seal. Jonas read it twice before he let Agatha see. It said a man was searching for 4 children fitting their description, 3 boys and a girl, aged 4. He claimed to be kin, though his name wasn't listed. No official warrant. No return address. Just a warning written in a careful hand, he's asking questions near the river towns. Agatha read it once and then set it gently on the table, as if it might explode. What if it's true, she asked. What if someone means to come for them? Jonas looked at the fire, his hands tightening on the back of the chair. Then we'll see what kind of man he is. Some kin don't deserve to come calling. The question lingered in the air, sour and shapeless. What if someone tried to take them? Not legally, not kindly, but as if reclaiming livestock, not children. That evening, Agatha pulled her shawl tight and told Jonas about a woman she once knew in Missouri, who took in 2 orphan girls during a winter sickness. Raised them, fed them, named them. But when spring came, a distant uncle arrived with a bottle in one hand and papers in the other. Took them screaming. The girls were never seen again. Jonas didn't speak. He just held her hand as she cried, her head against his shoulder, watching the fire die down. The days turned brittle, the sky holding its breath in the hours before snow. Still, Jonas taught the boys how to brush the mule and lift the saddle. Agatha began knitting them scarves in reds and blues, unraveling an old wedding shawl to get enough yarn. Rose helped her with the knots, her fingers clumsy but eager. One afternoon, Jonas found Clay sitting alone in the stall with the mule, the carved wooden horse beside him. He was staring into the dust like he was waiting for something. Jonas sat beside him and didn't ask anything. Just took out his knife and began carving another horse. Clay reached out and placed a hand on Jonas's knee, quiet, soft. Jonas said, "You don't gotta talk. Just stay." Clay leaned his head against Jonas's side. And that was enough. But not everyone saw it the same way. Pastor Whitfield came to visit, hat in hand, boots clean as always. He stood at the edge of the porch like the land might swallow him if he crossed. Agatha served tea, though she didn't invite him in. "You know the law, Jonas," the pastor began. "If someone claims blood..." Jonas cut him off. "He ain't claimed them. He's just asking questions." Still, the pastor said softly, "A paper trail matters. These children, they're not yours. Not yet." Agatha set her cup down hard enough to crack the saucer. "They're more ours than the ones who never wanted them." Whitfield looked between them. "You'll need signatures. And witnesses. And if someone contests..." "Let them," Jonas said. "Let the court hear the names they picked, the nights they cried, the way that boy hums when the fire's just right. Let them come see what love looks like after loss." The pastor didn't argue. Just nodded and left, his coat flapping in the wind like a flag that had lost its color. The next day, Eunice Rayburn sent word. She'd spoken to a deputy in the next town, said someone matching Jonas's description had been asking about adoption forms without a marriage record to prove stability. How can a childless couple think they know what's best for 4? Agatha didn't answer. Instead, she lit a candle and began to write letters to the county clerk, to the old preacher who had married them, to anyone who might bear witness. Not to defend, but to declare. They hadn't asked for this. Not the children, not her, not Jonas. But maybe some blessings arrive like storms, unwanted, unavoidable, and somehow holy when they pass. One evening, as snow flurried and smoke curled from the chimney, Rose climbed into Agatha's lap and asked softly, "Did you always want 4?" Agatha kissed her forehead. "I wanted someone to call mine." Rose nodded like she understood something too deep for her years. "We didn't know what we wanted. Just, not to be afraid." That night, the children slept closer to each other than usual, their limbs tangled, their breath soft as feathers. Jonas stepped outside into the cold. The moon was a silver cut in the dark, and the wind carried the smell of something old, like fire and frost and fate. He didn't know who the man in the letter was, or when he'd arrive. But he knew this much. Whatever the children came from, whatever shadow had followed them, it was not welcome here. This was their home now. And home wasn't something given. It was something made one gesture, one fire, one carved wooden horse at a time. Inside, Clay rolled over in his sleep and whispered something no one could understand. But Jonas smiled. It was the sound of a voice remembering how to be a child again. It was late afternoon when the man rode in. Dust clung to his boots, and the leather of his long coat shone with wear. He didn't dismount at first, just sat tall in the saddle at the end of the path, watching the house like it might lunge. His horse pawed at the dirt, sensing its rider's tension. Jonas stepped out of the barn with a rope coiled over his shoulder and saw him there, still as a cross planted in dry soil. "You Jonas Talbot?" the man asked, voice low and scratchy. "I am." The man nodded once, slow. "Name's Royce Cutter. Heard you got 4 children here belonged to my brother. He died in a wagon wreck round Dagger Ridge." Jonas didn't blink. "They came to my door on their own feet. Didn't give a name. Didn't mention a wreck." Royce shrugged. "Still, they're blood. And blood's got claim." Jonas let the rope drop to the ground. His voice was steady, but inside him, something ancient stirred. "Blood's not always family." Royce dismounted finally and approached, boots thudding heavy across the earth. His coat swung open, revealing a worn deputy's badge half buried in dust and rust. "You saying you're keeping them? Without papers? Without kin?" "I'm saying they'd had enough taken from them already." At that, Agatha stepped into the doorway. She held no weapon, wore no scowl, just her apron and a shawl draped over her shoulders, and the eyes of a woman who had buried too many hopes to let anyone take these children now. The late sun hit her hair, catching threads of gold in the brown, and for a moment, she looked taller than the doorway itself. Royce glanced up at her, then back at Jonas. "She your wife?" "She's theirs," Jonas said. "Same as I am." The screen door creaked, and little footsteps whispered behind Agatha. Clay peeked around her skirt. When he saw Royce, his breath caught. His body stiffened, not with curiosity but with recognition. His small hand clawed at Agatha's apron, and in that single motion, something shattered. Royce noticed it too. He tilted his head, a smirk twitching. "Well. Looks like he remembers me." Jonas stepped forward once. "And he's shaking." "I ain't done nothing to 'em," Royce said, too quick, too smooth. "They're just skittish. Ain't been raised right." Agatha's voice cut in then, soft, low, and sharp. "They've been raised in fear." "You want to know who did that?" Royce laughed, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Don't take much to twist a child. You'd be surprised what they remember wrong." Jonas didn't move. "You come here to scare them again, or you got a legal reason to be on my land?" Royce tapped the badge. "This enough?" "No," Agatha said behind him. "That's not a badge. That's a prop. And you're not law, you're just someone who left them behind and didn't expect them to be loved when they got found." Royce's mouth twitched. "You talk real high for a woman with no children of her own." Jonas's jaw tightened. But before he could answer, Agatha stepped down from the porch, walking slowly but without pause until she stood between Royce and the children still watching from the shadows. She's not afraid, Jonas thought. Not anymore. Agatha's eyes burned steady. "You want to hurt them, you'll have to get through me. And you might think I'm small, but you'd be wrong." Royce looked around. No crowd, no deputies, no witnesses. Just wind, quiet, and a man with nothing left to lose. "I'll be back," he muttered. "With paper. With law." "You do that," Jonas said. "But don't come in the dark. This house don't open to wolves after dusk." Royce mounted up. His horse turned as if relieved. He didn't look back. After he rode out, the air thickened. The children didn't move for a long time. Rose was the first to cry, not loud, not frantic. Just quiet tears that stained her dress and slipped into Agatha's shawl as she held her close. Later that night, they all slept in the main room, Jonas and Agatha laying blankets on the floor near the hearth. The children formed a circle between them, like they used to sleep in ditches and barns, trusting each other's breathing more than strangers' roofs. Agatha sat near the fire, hands still. "He's not done," she whispered. "I know," Jonas replied. She looked at him. "We need help. Real help. Paper help." He nodded. "We'll go to Mrs. Lottie tomorrow. She knows people. Folks who can sign what needs signing." Agatha's gaze drifted toward the children, sleeping in uneven shapes of safety. "I used to think I'd never be a mother," she said. "Now I know I just hadn't met them yet." Jonas reached across the quilts and took her hand. "You stood in the doorway like one." The fire cracked. Clay shifted in his sleep and reached for Jonas's boot, resting his hand there like a promise not to let go. Outside, a wind stirred the trees, but the cabin stood. Inside, it was full with warmth, with breath, with a love strong enough to be tested. Tomorrow would bring papers or men or judgment. But tonight, it brought a kind of peace no one could steal. The storm broke just after dawn. Not rain, but people. Royce Cutter returned with 2 men and a folded sheaf of yellowed papers clutched in his fist. They came up the ridge in silence, their horses trailing breath in the frost. No lawman accompanied them, just Royce riding like he had something to prove and 2 shadows behind him who looked like they'd been paid in coin and Rotka to follow orders. Jonas saw them from the barn and didn't shout. He simply straightened his back and walked toward the house. Agatha had already stepped onto the porch, her shawl over her shoulders, her hair braided down her back. She didn't look at the riders. She looked at the 4 children huddled behind the window. They were watching with wide eyes, faces pressed to the glass. Royce halted 10 feet from the porch. "I brought proof," he called out. "Their names. Birth lines. Kinship. Don't matter what's scribbled," Jonas said, voice flat. "Only thing that matters is who stayed." One of the men with Royce dismounted and unfolded the papers with greasy fingers. "It's enough to make a claim in this county." "Maybe," Jonas said. "But not enough to make a family." The second man put his hand on his hip like he carried iron there. The thread hung like smoke. Royce gestured to the house. "I ain't gonna ask nice again. They're my brothers. That makes 'em mine. I'll raise 'em. Feed 'em. Train 'em right." From the porch, Agatha spoke, quiet but unshakable. "You had your chance, Royce. They don't flinch when we touch them. They don't cry at night anymore. But they did, before. They still wake up shaking some mornings. Clay hasn't said a word in months, but I've heard him hum. You know how much healing it takes for a child to hum again?" Royce looked away, jaw tightening. "You think you're saints? You think I'm the devil?" "No," Jonas said. "I think you're a man who didn't want the work but can't stand someone else doing it better." That stung. Royce turned to his men, ready to bark something ugly, but paused. A figure was walking up the trail from the east. Old, wrapped in gray wool, leaning on a cane. Mrs. Lottie Gray. She walked straight through the standoff, not even sparing the riders a glance. Her voice, when it came, was thin but firm. "I filed guardianship papers with the county clerk 2 weeks ago. Witnessed by Pastor Whitfield and notarized by Deputy Jameson himself." Royce's men blinked. She held up a stamped envelope like it was scripture. "You've no legal claim here." Royce's mouth opened, then closed. His fists curled, but the wind caught the corner of his coat and flapped it like a flag surrendering. He turned his horse, pulling the reins so hard the beast grunted. "This ain't over," he spat. "No," Jonas said. "It's just begun for them." They rode off. No drama, no gunshots. Just dust in retreat. And silence. The children came out slowly, one by one. Sam ran to Jonas and clung to his waist. Eli followed, fists balled. Rose stood near Agatha, looking not at the road but at the sky, as if she'd been holding her breath since morning. Clay stood at the top step and stared after the riders. Then, for the first time, he turned to Jonas and spoke. "Home. A single word, thick with dust and memory. Jonas felt his knees weaken. Agatha cried, the kind of cry that makes no sound. She wrapped all four of them in her arms, and Jonas dropped beside them, arms closing around the whole fragile pile of bones and breath. Later that week, the county clerk sent official documents. Names typed. Signatures fresh. The Talbots, Jonas and Agatha, were listed as guardians by law, not just love. The townsfolk changed, slowly. Eunice Rayburn started bringing jars of peach preserves. Pastor Whitfield asked the children to help ring the church bell on Sundays. Gossip turned into something softer. Respect, maybe. Or shame. Spring came with sudden green, and the porch filled with the smell of soap and stew. The children laughed louder now, unafraid to run too far from the house, knowing someone would call them back with kindness. Jonas built a swing from the old oak. Agatha planted rows of marigolds along the fence. Clay spoke more often now, in small bursts, naming birds, counting buttons, singing parts of Rose's old humming songs. At night, Jonas carved wooden animals by lantern light and placed them on the shelf above their beds, one for each dream they didn't yet have words for. One warm evening, the family walked into town together. Jonas in his cleanest shirt. Agatha in a soft cotton dress. Rose wore a blue ribbon. The boys had suspenders too big for their small shoulders. The streets quieted as they passed, not in judgment this time, but in reverence. People stepped aside. Hats were tipped. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The family had stood in the wind. And stayed. The Talbots didn't ask for applause. They just held hands and walked forward, like something whole, woven together not by blood, but by choice over and over, in dawns and dusks and sleepless nights. Some say family is who you're born to. Others say it's who claims you. But sometimes, it's simpler than that. Sometimes, family is who stands with you when the wind comes. And stays.